My name is Maeve McElgurm and I am the Programme Manager for the Linen Biennale Northern Ireland project. I'm delighted to be here with Alice Fox. Alice is currently showing her wonderful exhibition Flaxen in our Space Gallery in Lisburn. Um, the format for this is I'm going to do a short introduction for the Biennale and who Alice is. And then I'm going to hand over to Alice for the bulk of the talk. And maybe I'll have a few questions at the end. I'm not too sure, but let's just see how it goes. So, the Linen Biennale Northern Ireland is a project led by our Space Gallery. After lots of hard graft by gallery co-founders Anthea and Robert, the first Biennale took place in 2018, aiming to provide a platform for conversations around linen and the role it has played in shaping Northern Ireland. Celebrating our material heritage was a major theme for 2018, as was a desire to explore how flax and linen is now inspiring artists, makers, designers, performers, and manufacturers. The Biennale was revived in 2023, again with a big emphasis on heritage thanks to the support of the National Lottery Heritage Fund. This is where I joined the team as project manager, and the intention was to revive the Biennale itself after a COVID hiatus and also celebrate those who were already reviving linen's place in Northern Ireland's story. Through the festival and by building networks and collaborative partnerships, we aim to renew our collective understanding and appreciation of linen's legacy, its current value, and its enormous potential as a sustainable material for the future. Now, here we are in 2025, and a small but still beautiful Biennale under the theme Regroup and React has shifted its focus slightly towards the contemporary. This year, we are particularly interested in projects that explore the intersection of past and present, emphasizing the critical link between sustainability and creativity. We're approaching the very end of the project now, and it's been a pleasure to engage with so many passionate, talented, and inspiring people. When Alice sent us her expression of interest last winter, I was so excited because the proposed work was interwoven with so many of our themes and priorities. I knew we just had to bring it to Northern Ireland, and I'm delighted that after a challenging year, we were able to make it happen. Now, Alice probably needs no introduction for most of you listening, but for formalities, Alice is a UK-based textile and natural fibre artist whose process-led, sustainability-centred practice springs from a deep personal engagement with the natural landscape. With a background in physical geography and nature conservation, she works intuitively with found, foraged, grown and gathered materials, transforming them through natural dyes, stitch, weave, soft basketry techniques into tactile surfaces, sculptural surfaces, structures, and delicate vessels. Most of her creative exploration unfolds in her allotment in West Yorkshire, where she cultivates and experiments with plant-based fibres, discovering their expressive potential. Alice holds an MA in creative practice and exhibits, lectures, and teaches both nationally and internationally. And now that I've got through the bio, I'm going to turn my camera off and let Alice take over and share her beautiful presentation on her body of work, Flaxen, and how we got to that process, how we get to where it is now. Okay.
Thanks, Maeve. Brilliant. Okay, just going to share my screen. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you, Maeve, for that really lovely introduction. And as Maeve said, I'm going to talk about the project that is currently on show in our Space Gallery. So this, if you step into the gallery for the rest of this week, this is what you will be greeted with. So I'm going to talk about the work that's there, but I'm going to go right back to the beginning of how this project developed, and talk you through the different processes and so on that have kind of led to the point of showing it in Northern Ireland. So, as Maeve said, I have an allotment, and the allotment has been the focus of my practice since 2017 when I first took it on, and that was when I was doing an MA Um, and I wanted to really explore the ideas around self-sufficiency in materials for my practice. And so, although I was using very much textiles based skill set and experimenting with basketry techniques, I wanted to really explore how I could use the materials that were available to me on this particular site. So, what you see in the bottom right here is flax growing, and obviously flax is the kind of focus of what we're talking about today. I've grown a small patch of flax on my allotment each year for the last 9 or 10 years. So started growing it just before I took on the allotment, and I grow a small amount each year, and I process it by hand and so on. And it's I'm sure that a lot of people watching this talk might know a bit about flax and have already got an interest in it. And I'm not going to sort of go into a huge amount of detail about all the different processes, but is an absolutely stunning plant. Obviously, it's where we get our linen from, but a lot of people wouldn't recognize the actual plant, even though they might recognize the fibre that they're wearing. So it's a beautiful plant. It's very easy to grow in this northern European climate. It has these beautiful flowers which only last a few hours each. So it's a it's kind of an elegant plant, really. And actually, the growing bit is the easiest part of it. So it grows over 100 days is the sort of standard set of time from sowing through to harvest, but obviously that will change a little bit depending on weather conditions. When the when the plant is harvested, we pull up the whole plant. So this is last season's flax on my allotment, pulled up, and you can see that the roots are on the bottom. You literally pull the whole plant up, and then there's a whole set of other stages that you go through to take that plant through to a usable fibre, and to then be used in a conventional way. So this is spun thread in my hands here that has been through all these different processes, and you're going to see a little bit of that later on when I go through some of the stages of the project. But it in a sense for me, going through all those processes from seed, growing the plant, and then the processing, and then even the spinning, it's massively time consuming, but it imbues a huge amount of kind of value, if you like, in the ball of yarn that might be then held in the hand as a result. I've handled and engaged with that material at every stage of its process. So, having ended up with the project showing currently in Northern Ireland, the whole thing started down in Cornwall. So this is Kestle Barton, which is on the Lizard in Cornwall. So it's 400 miles south of where I am in Yorkshire. And I started talking to Kestle Barton about doing a project probably about 2.5 years ago now, and it's a beautiful place. It's really quite remote in Cornwall. It's tucked away. It's an old farmstead that has a gallery and various different elements to the site. This is it from the air. So we've got a gallery, we've got farm buildings that are transformed into cottages, and then we've got this land. So what you're seeing here is the orchard, the kind of grid of trees in the orchard, which is traditionally managed. They grow, they have a nuttery as well. They have a really beautiful garden, and then to the left of the grid of orchard trees there is the meadow, and then there's a sort of snaking path that goes down through the meadow to a circle at the bottom there. So that little circle, that patch of land at the circle, is became the focus of this whole project. So the idea was that we would grow flax in this circle. So this is now looking into the circle. You walk through the meadow and you come to this area where there's a kind of raised section of land with these little yew trees on it, and so it's hidden. It's quite kind of tucked away, and you only kind of realise that there's a circle there when you get to this gap in the raised circle. And they've used this little piece of land for various different installations and sort of growing art projects in the past, and so we felt it would be really nice to grow some flax there and use that as the focus of this project. So this is it in winter, and you can see it's really quite wet looking, but just to kind of give you an idea of the scale and so on, this is a good starting point. So we'd talked about we basically devised a project where we would grow some flax on site. I would do a number of I would pay a number of visits. So I had a sort of series of residency periods of residency down there at Kestle Barton, working with the flax or growing the flax and running events around people getting involved in growing and processing the flax, but that I would also engage with other materials from the site. And this is quite typical of the way that I work. I tend to kind of work with different materials and do different things with them. So this is an example from the first period of time that I spent down there, January 2024. So nearly 2 years ago. And I had a period of time there in the winter. There was hardly anyone around. It was really quiet and kind of secluded spending time there. And as you can see, I gathered various things. So I would walk and gather materials. I tend to not necessarily know what I'm going to do with the materials when I gather them, but then there's a period of kind of exploring them, and you can see sketchbook pages and lists and various different things and sorting of materials. So that's for me, that's a kind of first stage of engaging with these different materials is this kind of sorting, often drawing, maybe mark making, and using the materials to kind of start to generate ideas about work. So, for example, here we've got ash twigs that I've cut up into sections. There are sycamore keys on there. There's a drawing of the ash twigs. So this is the sort of exploratory work early on in the project. Um, I then start kind of experimenting with those materials and bringing them together in different ways. So some of these kind of very early experiments actually ended up being pieces of work that were in the final show. So although the flax was the kind of focus of the project, these other materials tell a story about engaging with the place and the rest of the landscape around there and so on. And I call these material sketches. So although I am sketching in sketchbooks as well, actually see these three-dimensional explorations as sketches as well. So I'm testing out ideas, I'm testing techniques. I might take a technique that I know well, but I haven't done it with these particular materials. So we've got here, there are stems from the miscanthus that was being cut in the gardens that were woven into the curled piece at the back. The front section is stubble from a local field that I was walking through, and then mud from they've been woven together with silk that was dyed with plant material from the place, but then also mud from the creek. So there are all these lovely really muddy tidal creeks around there, and Frenchman's Creek, which some people will have heard of from the Daphne du Maurier book, is set in this place. So that's mud from Frenchman's Creek. So I was engaging with materials. I was planning how and when we would grow the flax, and I was also gathering material that I could make inks with. So recording colour, natural colour is also something that I tend to do, particularly in a place that I'm kind of trying to explore and record. Taking natural dyes from the plants that are there is a really nice way into a place for me. So I started building up this kind of record of the place, and so this is that sort of January winter time, and we've got here colours from various plants, but there's also mud there from different places that I gathered on walks, and this is something that you'll see gets added to as I go along. So that was the first kind of section of the residency, and then I returned in April last year. And the plan then was that we would be sowing the flax. So this was just after Easter and ordinarily, that's a good time to be sowing the flax. Traditionally, we would sow flax on Good Friday, just like you plant your potatoes. And although that's obviously Good Friday moves about, and I think that's more about when people have got a day off rather than in the calendar, rather than it being perfect conditions. And when one of the things that we really kind of learned through running this project was that we had to put dates in a diary to arrange events, but actually the reality of what was happening with the conditions on site meant that those dates were not actually the ideal times to do things. So we ended up with people coming for this event in April, but the ground was too wet to sow the flax. But what we did was introduce the project to people, tell people about how we grow the flax. So this group of people we then called Team Flax, because then some of them came and were involved in some of the other stages. So it was really nice to be able to share that process and tell people about the different stages of how we would grow the flax. So while I was there that April, so it was the ground was really wet, as you can see from the left here. So this is in the woods just down below, below the fields where we were going to be growing the flax. It was very wet. It was such a wet spring. Conversely, actually, the conditions up here in Yorkshire at that same time would have been absolutely perfect for sowing the flax. And so it just shows that you can't kind of predict these things. But so while I was there, we had the event, but again, there was another period of walking, gathering materials, recording the place in different ways. So anyone who's been into the exhibition will have seen a few stones in the vitrine that have got writing on. So I tend to write on different materials that I gather as part of that recording, recording the place. And I continued with the ink making. So we've got here some of those different stages of that. There's gorse flowers there on the right that would have made a beautiful yellow ink, bramble leaves, and at the back I think it's nettle. So I was kind of doing this all at the same time, creating those kind of color-based records, and more of those material sketches. So so again, we've got examples here of there's colour there, there's different bits and pieces picked up, there's a leaf and a stone with writing on, there's a woven section there with hazel twigs which had got buds that are almost could have opened. They were sort of ready to burst, but those were twigs that had fallen and I used. And then down at the bottom left we've got a net made with bindweed stems. So really just exploring and more of those kind of material sketches at this point. And then obviously the flax was still needed to be planted, but we couldn't plant it that week, sow it that week. So it got delayed by 10 days or so. And then the staff on site then sowed it at the agreed time. So this is that color chart. You can see now it's starting to be added to. So the second visit, we've got the kind of springtime visit in there to build up those colors. So as I say, the staff on site then sowed the seed at the point that we'd agreed, and because I was then back at home in Yorkshire by then, I could sow my flax on the same date. So that there was this lovely kind of synchronicity of being able to grow flax 400 miles apart from the same dates and just be able to really kind of compare how that worked. And then obviously by July, we were at a point where we'd got to 100 days on from that sowing, and it was then pretty much ready to harvest. So what we see here is that same circle. It's the flax has grown, the flax has flowered by this point and has gone over. You can see little fence round the actual flax itself. So early on when it was germinating, we realised that there were all sorts of different animals that were going in there. And there's actually, if you go onto my website, you can find the little film that was done by the staff on site of using a kind of camera trap thing. And we've got all sorts of different animals that were in there. So we ended up fencing that off. So the flax grew, and then it was time to harvest it. We had, in the end, it was a difficult growing season, and I think a lot of people have found that this year it was, last year rather, it was an unusually wet in the spring. The flax that was grown down at Kestle Barton was actually a lot shorter than what I ended up growing on my allotment in Yorkshire, which was a surprise initially, but actually when we started thinking about it, this was grown in quite an unimproved part of the field, so it wasn't necessarily that fertile, whereas my allotment is very much improved and so on, and more kind of controlled growing conditions. When we came to the event that we'd agreed to harvest it. Um, we again wasn't necessarily the best weather for pulling it up, and actually we could have done, because it wasn't a particularly warm period up until that point. The flax wasn't quite as ripe, the seeds weren't quite as ripe as I would have ideally liked it. But again, we'd put a date in the diary, and we had invited people, so we just got on with it. So we had some of Team Flax came back, and we were pulling the flax by hand. And and then you can see the table there. Some people are rippling, so they're removing the seeds from the flax at that point, so that we could then let it ret. So retting is a process that you have to go through in order to be able to extract the fibre from the stems. So it's when you're growing it on a large scale like this, you would generally lay it out in the field. So you can see there, these have been laid out around the outside of the circle, and that then is laid out for up to a couple of weeks, depending on the weather conditions and the whether it's damp and rainy or dry, and the temperature and so on. The retting can take different times, so you have to kind of monitor it. And again, there was a kind of, we had to put processes in place for that, because I'm not there all the time. So I came home, and then the staff there were monitoring it and turning it. And I think, yeah, you can see here the bits on the right, the section on the right hand side there has been turned. So where it's gone browner, you can see that's been what was underneath, and then it's been turned over. And so you can see it's really changing. It's going brown, but it's also what the retting is doing is it's breaking down some of the pectins and so on in the stalks, which mean that you can then remove the fibre from those stems in order to then work with that fibre. So so that was in July. We'd harvested, we'd pulled it up. It was then left to ret, and then at a point where I think we ended up having kind of FaceTime little calls to kind of check whether it was ready or not. So you have to kind of test it to see whether the fibre will come away easily. Once that we were happy that it retted enough, then the Kestle Barton gang brought it in. This is in the pavilion there, which is a sort of covered space down in the orchard, where it could be brought in and then it could be dried. And that's the next stage. So it gets dried off before it can then be processed. And I mean, there was a lot of flax there. So this is way more in terms of the amount of flax than I've ever grown myself before. So it was a lot of flax then to deal with potentially. But wonderful to have this kind of crop of it. Not as long as as I was saying, it was grown quite short compared to how it might have done, but it was still a good set of usable fibre. So September was the next visit. That was the next time I was down, and that was timed to coincide with the time when we could then start to process the fibre. So it's been retted, it's been dried, and then you start this set of other actions that will then take it to a stripped fibre. So we've got here on the left, we've got a breaker which has got this actually has three different processes included in this kind of simple machine, this lovely thing that's made by Flaxland. And so there's a breaker, there's a scutching board, and there are hackling combs on there too. So basically what we do is we take a small section of the retted and dried stems. They get processed through the breaker. So what you see on the right here is my view as I'm using that breaker. So it's you're basically snapping the inside of the stems, you're bashing this thing down on the stems, so it starts to break away the kind of insides and leave us the fibre. So you can start to see that it's breaking down into something more fibrous. And then there's scutching, which is a kind of scraping, which again removes the rest of the bits of the stem that we don't want. And what we're then left with is the fibre that you can see here, and then hackling, which is a kind of combing. Basically, you can see the different sized nails, and for doing that. So it basically, you get finer and finer and more processed material that as you go through this. So yeah, and then this is the result. So this is a handful of fully processed flax fibre, on site, held up in front of the circle where it was grown. And what you see in my hand there is probably about 4 or 5 hours work. So for one person doing it by hand, obviously it's a very slow process, but that fibre is fully of the place, and has been through my hands many times. So during that September visit, I also was carrying on with some of those other experiments. So the focus then was about the processing, but also started to kind of think about how I could be using that flax to create works that would be then shown in the gallery. So this was one of the early pieces, and that again, that's in the exhibition that's up currently. So this was taking stems that full stems with their seed head still on. So obviously most of the fibre we processed, as you've just seen, I've just explained, but I kept some of the stems aside, to not be retted, and then that would mean that I could use them at different stages. So they've got their roots on, they've got their seed heads on, and I could then explore that. And really, for me, what interests me creatively is more about being experimental with the material at different stages, rather than just using it in that conventional processed and then spun way. And although I could weave a piece of cloth with that flax, that what's then become linen. As soon as it's a spun thread, we then start calling it linen rather than flax. But for me, creatively, actually exploring the processes and the material at different stages in its processing is actually what I was most excited about. So that was the full year last of 2024. So we'd grown the flax. I'd started experimenting with how I might then use it in work. Obviously, there was all those other material sketches and experiments going on. So those were all going to feed into the exhibition that would be this summer we've just had. So I returned to Kestle Barton in February this year, um, and for a kind of final visit for kind of a residency period. So again, I was exploring materials. By then, I obviously had a really good idea of the works I was wanting to make. And one of the things that had really struck me from the winter visits were these thorns, the bare winter hedges with these, particularly blackthorn, with these huge, great thorns. And I had started gathering some of those thorns the previous winter, but this February, that became a real focus. And I'd planned a piece of work that would span the whole width of the gallery, basically, made up of these thorns. So the February visit this was the focus, was to make this piece with thorns. So I gathered, I think I'd worked out that I needed around about 1,000 thorns to make the piece I wanted to do. It ended up actually a bit more than that, but I had to sort of make a calculation and then adjust it. So I was gathering thorns on walks from a whole range of different hedges, so they weren't just from one patch. So obviously I was carefully spreading around the way that I was gathering them, so as to not impact individual bushes and so on. And then they got sorted into different lengths, and then these are piles of 10. So for me, this was a way of partly of counting them, but also just to kind of sort them into their different characteristics. And then I started making the piece. So what you see here is a pretty Heath Robinson way of weaving. So because this piece was going to be about 4.5 meters long, and it wasn't something I could weave on a conventional loom, so I ended up finding a way of got a long warp that was the length of that I needed the piece to be. So that's what you see chained up on the left there, and some of the flax fibre is kind of in the bottom part of that image. And then on the right, what you see is a frame. It's an old picture frame that I use for sometimes for weaving on. You can really use the most basic of equipment for this kind of thing. And then I have ways of kind of clamping and attaching the warp onto that frame, but so that I could then move it on as I worked. So I'm basically stitching these leaves onto that warp and then moving it down a section. So I created I made most of that piece of work in that visit in the February on site, and then this is the first time I was able to actually just test it. So in March of this year, I had a week at a studio up in North Yorkshire called Lund Studios, and they gave me a week to kind of use a bigger space to test out these larger works and also to construct some of the larger works. So I was for the first time able to actually stretch this out on a wall and see how it might hang. And again, the practicalities of actually hanging a piece of work. There's one thing having an idea about how it might work, but actually until you actually start to put it up on the wall, there were things that then I needed to kind of adjust as a result. So the main focus of this week in March was to make the big round piece that is currently at our space. So this piece is called Flax in the Round, and this piece really this was about reflecting on that where we grew the flax, so the fact it was in this circle, and I wanted a piece of work that kind of referenced that and that really showed had impact on a scale that, so when you walked into the gallery there was this piece of work that was that really celebrated the plant, and has roots and shoots and seeds and all. So I knew kind of how I wanted to make this piece. I'd commissioned an aluminium frame from a metal fabricator I know that would support the piece and that it could be fixed to the wall. But until I actually got to this point, I didn't really know how I was going to make it. I knew that there was going to be some kind of woven element to hold the pieces together. So this week became really kind of key to basically just working it out and then making the piece. And so what I ended up actually doing is the piece on the left. What you can see is it looks like a continuous run, but I started by making little sections with 10 stems each and weaving those together, and then I could join those. So I had these little units that I could then join into one continuous piece, and then once I'd done that, I then had to work out how to actually for it to actually fit the frame and so on. So it was a case of definitely figuring it out as I went. Of course, this piece then also had to be able to be dismantled and moved. So the frame I had made comes into four pieces. The flax piece is literally stitched onto the piece, and so when it's taken down it will then also have to be removed from that and rolled up, and so it's kind of it all just kind of developed in that week of figuring out how to make it. And then this is the final piece that will is in the gallery and on the wall. So it looks I mean it looks incredibly delicate. It's the stems are stronger than they look because they've still got that really integral fibre in there. But yeah, that circle with the roots on the inside has a real kind of impact to it. So that was the big flax piece, and then the other large flax piece, which again has kind of been through a sort of series of developments, if you like. So I knew I wanted to make something really long. I have this. This is the tapestry loom that's in my living room, which so my whole house has kind of become the studio basically, and so I can weave a piece that is 80 centimeters wide on that. So I'm weaving I'm weaving it kind of on its side. So what you see on the frame there is the warp then becomes the horizontal of how I've hung it. And again, we've got whole stems, so we've got seed heads on one side and the roots on the other, and I'm literally stitching each one onto that warp. So that's the process. And basically, I what I wanted was as long as piece a piece as possible. So I made this in 5 sections so that it would be 4 meters when it was fully kind of hung together. And so this is one of those finished pieces. So again, you've got when it's off the loom, it looks incredibly fragile. It's actually a lot stronger than it looks, but there's this beautiful rhythm of the stems, and then there's a rhythm of the how the warp kind of interacts with that. And then we've got them kind of held with their roots at the bottom. So this is it hanging in the gallery in Cornwall, and as it was originally intended to hang in one piece like that, in one run, with the roots at the bottom, and you've got that lovely kind of staining on the roots where they were underground, and then you've got the lovely shadows from the seed heads and so on. Um, and so then yeah, so here you can see the shadows, those beautiful shadows with the both the roots and the seed heads. Um, and then so what was really interesting and I suppose for me again creatively quite exciting was when we brought the work to Northern Ireland and to our space gallery. Um, because the space is different to where it was originally hung, there wasn't a length of wall that would have allowed for a 4 meter long piece. So we started thinking, right, how do we could I actually hang some of this in space? And in a way, it became so much more exciting as a result. So some of it hangs on the walls, you can see there, but then those 2 pieces that hang in space at the end there, and they just glow and catch the light really beautifully. So it was a learning experience in hanging them, but it was a wonderful thing to do, and and I really love how when you take work that is originally created for one space, but then you take it to other spaces, and how that becomes part of the creative process. So the work is finished, but it can still be displayed in really different ways, and it takes on a new life in each of those different stages. And the next time I show it, it will be hung differently again, and as a result, which is really exciting. Um, so we've got this is another view in the gallery. We've got the round piece at the end there, and then we've got I mentioned the vitrines. We've got these lovely cases, and so again, these are I suppose the details of what tell the story. So there are some of the materials that are gathered there. There's flax at different stages. There's sketchbooks there, and some of those leaves and pebbles that have been written on. So again, they really tell the story of the place and that wider engagement with the materials of that place. And again, just yeah, the the life that those pieces have taken on in that space, and particularly with the lighting in the gallery, how that's really kind of yeah, just brought them to life in a different way. And I think the other thing that when I started making this particular set of pieces, my intention was that it would be like the flax growing in the field, that you'd just taken a slice of that and kind of peeled it away and then hung it on the wall. And I'm really happy that it kind of feels quite like that, and that the way that we've hung it really kind of catches the light and that golden beauty that the flax has. And there it is again with its light in a different way. And then also just so that people know, the project has been recorded in a book which is currently available in the gallery, but is also available through my website. And again, that it sort of tells the story of the residency and how the project developed and the relationship with Kestle Barton, and then taking it through to the point where it was kind of finished work. And also the colour chart, which you can see there, is kind of complete with all of those through the year, the different colours through the year. That there was a limited edition print that we made for that, and again, those are available through my website. Um, So that is, I'm going to come out of my screen share now. That's that's the project, and I don't know if maybe if you've got any questions or if you want to talk through any of that.
That was lovely, Alice. Thank you so much for sharing with us. It was so, yeah, I mean, you went into so much detail about how it all took shape. I don't know, it made me almost a little bit emotional. Like I'm kind of looking forward to, I'm sad that the exhibition's finishing next week. Because yeah, it's really been really well received in the gallery, and it's also just a joy to go into, and like it just feels even more special like having heard
Mm.
um the background of how it kind of all shaped together, and your kind of thought, your processes and your thought processes that went into all of them. um Obviously, we intended to have this as a discussion initially, and that hasn't really quite worked out. So I feel a lot of pressure on
It's
question
fine.
wise, like there's probably loads of really good
It,
questions
yeah,
I don't know, but I did make
it's
some
fine.
notes.
Okay. Okay. Well, what I was going to say is if people watch this and then they have questions, and do contact me. I'm really happy to. I mean, I can talk about flax for, forever really. But yeah, if people have got questions directly, then that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good to know for everybody else watching. I guess one thing that stood out to me earlier in the Biennale program this year, one of the events that took place was we had a flax meho with a range of partners in Tyrone around the end of August there. And I really just loved how you spoke about, all these things of gathering and walking, and even just growing for so many years, 9 years in your allotment, basically a 2-year project at Kestle Barton. And there was Richie from the Gaia's Seed Project. He had this wonderful phrase, and it was like to grow to know. And it was like his idea of like, well, if we want to really bring back flax and linen production, the first step is everybody getting familiar with growing it so that you can like know what works well and what doesn't work well, and that like I don't know, I just thought it was a really interesting, like as an art project, that you have been growing this for so long yourself, and then how did it feel suddenly sort of scaling that up to then growing with other people and other staff and coordinating something that was really quite like I guess personal and small before.
Yeah, yeah, it's really quite a good point, really, because as I explained, I've always grown quite a small patch of it. It's um, even the sort of 3 square meters that I usually grow is then quite a lot of work to process it and so on. It was quite daunting, the idea of growing a bigger amount. We did work out what the kind of square meterage was, and I think off the top of my head it was about 200 square meters, which is, huge amount more than what I'd grown before. So daunting, but also we felt we could have grown a smaller patch, but we wanted impact also for, while it was growing, and that circle just had such a lovely kind of feel to it. So we talked about growing different amounts, and we just felt, actually, let's just fill that circle. It just felt absolutely right. And even if we didn't then use all of the fibre, even if we didn't fully process all of the fibre, that was okay. It on site, that absolutely made sense. When it actually came, I mean, the harvesting, as I said, I think it ended up being quite a wet day, or the morning was fine, and we had lots of volunteers, and everyone was really enthusiastic. By lunchtime, it was starting to rain, and quite a lot of people then disappeared, which was absolutely fair enough. And there was this kind of hardcore of us that were left doing it in the afternoon, and who got absolutely soaked, and and but we did what we could. We harvested what we could. We it yeah, it was an interesting learning curve. And I think the biggest issue with that was this thing I mentioned about, you put dates in the diary because you have to organize events and tell people about them. But actually, when I'm growing it on my own, I don't need to put a date in the diary. I know vaguely when I'm going to harvest it, but I'm going to fit that in with when it's actually ripe, when the weather's right, all of those things that you would adjust. But as soon as you're inviting people to come to an event, you can't be as flexible as that. So that was kind of interesting. And ideally, if we hadn't been inviting people, we would have harvested it, probably a bit later and let it ripen more and all of that stuff. So yeah, interesting kind of learning curve on that, but it was really important that we involved people in those processes and um, yeah, and we didn't get it all processed, but yeah,
Yeah.
it was
I think
yeah.
that, yeah, I think that's something kind of a little bit reassuring to hear. Obviously, in a perfect world, it would get processed and
Yeah, yeah.
I think, because there's no real infrastructure, I mean, there's not an infrastructure for
Mhm.
all of those processes anymore, and the idea of doing it all by hand.
Yeah.
But I guess it's reassuring to know that like you don't have to process it all if you grow it, even just growing it
Yeah.
on a small scale is a good start for people.
Absolutely. And I know quite a few people who've grown it because they're interested and they've got a bit of seed, they've grown it, and then they haven't necessarily wanted to go or have had the time to go through that whole processing stage, but they've still understood so much more. They've got a relationship with the plant that they wouldn't have had, and
Mm.
if they hadn't grown it. And it'll compost. Anything that doesn't get used, it will break down and so on. So yeah, I think the more people kind of just give it a go, and as I say, it's so easy to grow because it's adapted to our climate, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that again, that I've got two questions off of that. Sorry, and one of those things. One was that have you kind of worked in that public engagement way before? And then again on this idea of scale, because in the gallery, even I knowing what size flax is and having seen the work, online and the exhibition that was in previously, when I came in, the first 6 months, I was like, whoa, the scale, I wasn't expecting it in the actual work. And especially, followed your work for a while, and I'm really quite used to seeing, quite small things, like things that are quite intricate and like, yeah, that handheld, that kind of level. And then these pieces, flax and round, obviously they're made up of component parts.
Mm.
Um, but like there's a scale factor which is quite wow, and I
Mm.
think unexpected. So I don't know which order you want to reflect
Um,
on for them.
okay, so the first bit was about public engagement. I mean,
Yeah.
the thing is, I teach a lot, so
Yeah.
I'm used to running workshops. I'm used to that kind of thing. And actually, the engagement that those events that we had, they were quite relatively small scale. I mean, we were just open to anyone to come, and
Mhm.
but the nature of the site meant that it was never going to be a huge number. But yeah. So that was just a lovely kind of way of telling people, involving people in it, and so yeah, the kind of thing that I'm used to doing. In terms of scale, I mean, I think the main thing is uh I mean, often I'm making small work because I may be working with small amounts of material. This was an opportunity where, okay, we're growing stuff on a bigger scale, so we're going to have plenty of flax. I mean, actually, in the end, so the round piece is made from flax grown at Kestle Barton. The long pieces, the five long straight sections were actually flax from my allotment. So, and if if you're really nerdy about it, you can sort of tell a difference. There's a different kind of quality and length and so on. But I mean, maybe that's just me, because I know it intimately. But yeah, and I think for me, as an artist, to have the opportunity to make big work, to be because I'd been invited to make work for this for a gallery space. And I mean, we did talk about different scales of work, and I think there was a feeling that although I do often make quite small work, that actually to have impact in that space, and because it was a solo show, there needed to be big pieces, and that's where that big round piece, that I mean initially was kind of, there's got to be something you walk in and there's a kind of wow factor. So that was the beginnings of that. Um, the thorn, I mean, I know the thorns are not at our space, but I wanted to kind of include that because that was quite a key piece as well, because I felt like the flax was all about the summer and the growing and the kind of harvest time, whereas the periods of time I spent in the winter hedges, the bare hedges were the kind of that was for me the kind of real essence of my time there. And the other thing about that was one of the things that I thought that I wanted to make really early on was this piece that was span the whole gallery wall. And it was literally hung from hooks on either side of the gallery. It wasn't on the back wall. It was literally hung. And so it was like the gallery was the loom, was the frame. And that I just really liked that idea of having a piece that was kind of held by the gallery walls itself. So that's where that one came from. And although it's not big that way, it because it's big that way, it's got an impact. Again, you're kind of drawn into this line. So for me, having the opportunity, being given a space and said and being told make work for this space, that's absolutely, the best way of then having a reason to make big work. Generally, I'm making work for group exhibitions and it's got to be on a certain scale or whatever. So this slightly more sort of installation type work was a real excitement for me. And then of course it makes me think, oh, I want to make even bigger and more, and so it's great. It always kind of everything you make always leads on to other ideas, which is great. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's it's infectious that you're still excited
Yeah.
about it,
Yeah.
even though it's 2 years on and there's all
Yeah.
these other possibilities.
Yeah.
I guess just before we finish up, it would be a shame not to mention the other thing that really struck me was this is a lovely, and this is feedback that we've gotten in the visitor book and from people in the gallery. Like there's a beautiful simplicity with all the work, in how it looks, but actually that's it's really complicated. It's not, there's that kind of duality. It's like it's a simple process, but the kind of repetition, and I guess preciseness of having this line up and be all the same, that's really stood out for people. But one thing that came in your presentation, and obviously you've talked about it a bit more in your new book, Wild Weave, is the kind of the simplicity of some of the weaving techniques, that it doesn't need to be like, in Northern Ireland, a lot of people are really familiar with the kind of jacquard loom of it's the first computer, and it seems like an absolutely incomprehensible process until you know how to do it, I guess. Don't most things. But there was a lovely simplicity to some of your weaving techniques. And maybe if you just want to say a few words about your book.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I will mention the book, but I think it's funny because I've got just above my computer here, I've got a little phrase written down that someone once described my work as high octane simplicity, and like what you've just said, and I love that, which is why I've got it written down. And I think there's definitely a thread that runs through the thread, no pun intended, but through the way that I work is that all the processes I use they are simple. It's simple technology, it's simple processes, but it's in that repetition that I think the you build up impact, whether it's repetition of a number of pieces or it's repetition of the material and so on. And I think, I mean, certainly when I was at uni, when I was doing my textiles degree, and we were, I was starting to learn to weave, and although we were taught like different weave patterns and so on, I can remember thinking actually all I ever need is plain weave, because you can do so with the with interesting materials, but even with just, the simplest of materials, you can do so much with plain weave, with varying different elements. So I kind of feel like I don't ever need anything other than just a plain weave structure, really. Um, but yeah, and I think, that you're sorry, Maeve's just made me
Promote the book.
mention my World Weave, which was published last week, and is available through all good booksellers. And if you buy it from me, you get a signed copy. But it the key to that for me is sharing. Is trying to kind of help people understand you don't need lots of equipment. It's simply, a frame. I know I showed you my big tapestry loom, but the most basic frame, small frame, is all you need really for so much. And then it's about like being experimental with materials and so on, and you can do so much. So yeah, and I think there's definitely, for me, there's a lifetime in just a plain weave structure.
Yeah. No, I love it. I think that's a really nice note to end on as well, for particularly for any artists and makers who are looking for a bit of inspiration, or might be interested in trying to use a bit more natural materials or sustainably sourced materials, or what was the phrase you used, self-sufficiency in materials, themselves, that like, there's something beautiful in simplicity. And I think as well, it like really came across both in the book, the Flaxen publication, and in what you shared today about how there's this like deep engagement with the plants, the place, where they've come from, and then knowing that just makes the final pieces so much richer. So thank you very much, Alice.
You're
And
very welcome.
as I said, I'm not looking forward to taking down the show because we've enjoyed having it. But I have really enjoyed having you in the program, and it's been a pleasure to learn about your work.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.